Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on Zoom. Today's session will be a talk from Professor Paul Rogers. Before that, just a couple of housekeeping items. We are all on Zoom. We are being recorded. Hopefully, you have no objection. If you have a question, please put that in the chat function, and I will read it out, or Professor Rogers could read it himself. We've got about 40 minutes of talk, followed by half an hour of Q&A, and that will be it. So just before I introduce Professor Rogers, for those who don't know myself, I'm Sohail Shahryar, Chairman of the United Nations Association of Harpenden. The branch has been in existence since 1947, which is older than me. And we have about 187 volunteers and supporters and members covering Harpenden, St. Albans, and Wheat Hampstead, which is quite a large area. We normally have monthly talks. In June, we have had actually 3 sessions. One is to come. Today is another one. And a week ago, Professor Richard Sakwa talked to us on Ukraine issues. So today's talk will be from Professor Paul Rogers. He is the Emeritus Professor of Peace Studies at Bradford University, where he is currently sitting today. He's an Honorary Fellow of the Joint Service Command and Staff College. He has lectured regularly at senior UK defence colleges for almost 40 years, and has been an external examiner for the MA programs at the Royal College of Defence Studies and JSCSC. Educated at Imperial College and then lectured at Bradford. He has written or edited 30 books and over 150 papers and book chapters, including Losing Control, Global Security in the 21st Century. Paul is a regular broadcaster on radio and TV networks worldwide, averaging at least 150 interviews a year. So we are very fortunate to get Paul today. It is a Saturday, so please welcome Professor Paul Rogers.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to meet you today and do a talk. I must apologize at first in that I'm in the middle of having some dental work, as you can probably see if I made the mistake of smiling. So I'll try and remember to speak fairly slowly. It probably will take about 40 minutes because I've been given a very wide brief of global security challenges. And obviously I want to concentrate to some extent, but look at it in a very general way. This may well follow on from what Richard Sakwa was saying last week, which I would understand would be pretty broad in itself. So where do we start? I think it's fairly widely accepted that worldwide international security is facing something of a perfect storm. And it's a combination of the world economy not delivering what it was intended to, in other words, not delivering sufficient equity and progress, and a world which is in an environmental system in which the capacity of the entire global system to cater for human activity is being exceeded. And you put those two together and you have a major perfect storm. I would actually add a further factor, and that brings in security. So it's sort of economy, environment and security. And I think one of the major problems is we have a very major issue with how we look at security. And we have a very strong tendency to see it in terms of maintaining control, what some people call the control paradigm, others call simply lidism. You keep the lid on major problems and bring them under control, but you don't go beneath and work out why the problems are originating in the first place. You put those 3 together, and I think in some ways the problem becomes more difficult. I think we are entering a very difficult period, and the next 10, maybe even only 5 years will really mark out whether we really make serious progress. When we were talking about a talk like this, we didn't actually foresee fully what would be happening in Ukraine. Since you've already had a lot on that, you've got a discussion next week. I'll stay off that largely, except maybe during the discussion. I'm more than happy to talk about that. I do write fairly regularly for Open Democracy. I also write for a very interesting new think tank called Rethinking Security. You can get it at rethinkingsecurity.org. And that is really trying to look at this business of working out why our attitudes to international security just aren't working out right. And in fact, the organizer of it, Richard Reeve, and myself wrote a fairly lengthy blog piece on Ukraine after the first so many months. And that's on the website now, if you want to look at that in particular. Maybe before the discussion, it might be handy. So what I want to do really is to go through these three major problems, these trends or paradigms, if you like, look at what is the reason we have major issues, and then look at some of the possible solutions. Wherever I can, I want to bring in the role of the United Nations, but that will come probably particularly towards the end. For starters, two anecdotes, one very short, one longer. Many years ago, I was involved in helping organize a conference where I worked at the time, the then Huddersfield Polytechnic, trying to link together the issues of development and environment. And we had a brilliant talk from a senior lecturer in geography at Liverpool University, Edwin Brooks. And he talked about the way that if we didn't come to recognize that we were living in a finite world, then we were in for very big trouble. And he said, I think the dystopia we have to avoid is a crowded, glowering planet of massive inequalities of wealth, buttressed by stark force, yet endlessly threatened by desperate people in the global ghettos. Now, he was looking forward to that. That was back in 1973, so it's just short of 50 years ago. And I think we're a lot nearer that now. So that, if you like, is the background. The second, anecdotally, but I think it's 7, maybe 8 years ago, I had an email out of the blue, I think one April, from an academic at Pembroke College, Oxford, who was part of the research group on the changing characterization of war, the changing character of modern warfare. And he said that they were running a seminar the following July, which had a sort of government participants, and it was bringing together a lot of people who were experts in the issue of weak and failing states. And he said they really wanted to look at how that might affect British security. So it was very much British orientated. Then he said they rather wanted somebody who would do a bit of an overview at the start. And would I do that? Only speaking for 20 minutes or so, but essentially an extraordinary opportunity to sort of hold forth a bit and then actually listen to some top experts looking at areas like the Sahel, the Middle East, and all the rest for the rest of the day. So I said yes. He didn't actually say who the participants were. When I got there on the night before, I met him in the pub, and he said, well, the participants are essentially the commandant and all the senior officers of the SAS, with people from the Special Boat Service, MI6, MI5, Foreign Office, about 30 people in all. And it was part of a more or less an annual event funded by a private foundation, not by the taxpayer, which was to help prepare the special forces at senior officer level for looking ahead at the sort of problems they might have. And I gave my introductory talk and brought out the issues of the wealth poverty divide and climate breakdown, and the risks that unless you tackle these at roots, you're not going to get really anywhere. And it's not a question of trying to make sure you're secure once the things go wrong. I don't know how they took it, but interestingly, two things came up. The first speaker was a very bright analyst from Islamic Relief, talking about problems across the Middle East. Now, Islamic Relief is actually one of the largest aid agencies in Britain. It's more or less on a par with Christian Aid, and it's part of the Disasters Emergency Committee. And basically, they cover primarily the Middle East and Southern Asia. What she said was, at one point, she said, I just want to depart from my text just to say that Professor Rogers had talked about the dangers of climate breakdown. I want to say that that is just about the most common issue that comes from our field officers, worrying about the decline in harvest and food. Now, this was 7 or 8 years ago, and essentially things have changed hugely since then. But the whole purpose of the conference was really to prepare people for how to protect Britain if and when things went wrong. And I tried to explain and talk to people in the evening, essentially, that, you know, this wasn't necessarily the best way forward, that if you leave it that late, you're closing the castle gates, and you can't do that. 9/11 showed us that. But the attitude from the military side, quite understandably, was, well, you know, our role essentially is to protect the country, defend the realm. It's the job of the politicians to look at these problems. And I said, well, I don't know. I think in a sense, you need to be able to speak truth to power. As professional military people, you need to say to the politicians, look, this is the kind of issue which cannot be solved once it goes wrong. I don't know whether it got anywhere, but it does seem to be one of the central dilemmas. Let's go on and look essentially at these issues. I want to take the economy first, and this is obviously a very quick run through. In broad world history, obviously, the period from the early part of the 20th century was one in which the excesses of individual wealth creation were to an extent curbed. The antitrust legislation in the United States, which broke up these phenomenally large oil companies, is a good example of that. And what this meant that over the period of the first several decades, there was a slight diminishing in the way that wealth was concentrated in relatively few hands. And that was also, if anything, developed further after the end of the Second World War. Obviously, a major part of the world, a whole axis, had gone in for central planning. Many problems with that, but that was rather different from the pure sort of shareholder capitalism model, which was dominant elsewhere. Many Western countries, partly because of the pressures from their own populations after the experience in the 1930s, but also always with one eye over the shoulder at what the Soviets were doing, were really pretty keen on more social welfare. And we had a period, the Labour government in Britain and others elsewhere, in which you had a real increase in the whole issue of social welfare. You also had a lot of state intervention into economies, and you really had a system of rather more mixed economies. That worked, as far as the economists are concerned, reasonably well right through to the 1970s. But in the 50s and 60s, there was an alternative stream of economic thinking, which was much more concerned with what you might call market fundamentalism, the importance of the free market, going back more to the 19th century. And that was also tending to be called neoliberalism. And by the early 70s, there was a very powerful stream in economic thinking. Then, of course, came the huge oil price rises of 73, 74, and the world food crisis. Then it looked like the conventional economic system was in trouble. I'm still very surprised by people who look at the growth of neoliberalism in the 1970s and don't feed in those extraordinary developments. I mean, the older ones among us, and I'm sure if they're old enough, will recall that between October 73 and May 74, oil prices rose by 400%. Now, we're concerned at present when oil prices go up by 10, 20, or heaven forbid, 30%. 400% were at that level. And it shoved the world into an extraordinary period of stagflation, which really looked like the kind of economic system we had was coming apart. That gave the alternative view, the neoliberal view, a huge chance. And with the election, particularly of Ronald Reagan in 1980, and indeed Margaret Thatcher in 79, you had the neoliberal transformation. Now, obviously, the detail of that means, more privatization, a smaller state, but retaining its central power, no real reform of the taxation system, but certainly an easing of financial regulations. You had many other aspects at all, attempts to control labor systems, labor relations, and the rest. And the idea being that a more purely competitive system was the right way forward. That was what produced real progress. And one has to be clear that this is a very strongly held view, which took root very strongly during the course of the 1980s. And although it was very evident in the United States and Britain, through the so-called Washington Consensus, you also saw that it was exported across much of the global South. You would exclude China, and of course you would exclude the Soviet bloc. But then, of course, you had the Soviet bloc coming apart at the seams at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s. And this seemed to indicate without question that the neoliberal model was the way forward. Indeed, China was beginning to embrace what you might call authoritarian capitalism. So essentially, the world seemed to be very much set on this way. You had the famous book, The End of History. This was obviously going to be the way forward. Now, I know this is a long digression. I think it's important because it underpins one of the key things that happened over the last 40 years. And that is a slow but steady increase in wealth poverty disparities. It is not that the poor have got poorer worldwide. Everybody's benefited to some extent, but the benefits to a pretty small minority have been extraordinary. I mean, the rough thing is that if you take the entire world population, about 1 in 5 people worldwide have really done pretty well. Within that, some groups have extraordinary power. And the numbers quite mind-boggling. I mean, I won't quote a lot of statistics. I'll give you just two. One is you take the 1,000 richest people in Britain, 1,000 people, you know, enough who would fit into a modest-sized West End theatre. They currently control 730 billion pounds of wealth, just those 1,000 people. You know, we're talking about the total cost of COVID being 400 billion. Well, that 1,000 people actually control nearly twice as much as that. The extraordinary thing is the increase in which this divide is growing. Worldwide, there are about, I think, 2,500 billionaires. That group has increased its wealth by about 20% last year alone. So you're in an extraordinary position. And I think we're seeing this in all kinds of ways. And there's more and more concern about marginalization. We're seeing it in Britain with the growth of food banks and everything else. But that is really pretty fundamental. And there's no easy vision of this changing. There are very good groups like the New Economics Foundation, but this seems to be pretty set in its way in many ways. And even though states had to intervene hugely in COVID, that in many ways was a short-term measure which they could not avoid. So you've got that one issue. The world is more and more deeply divided economically. The second issue is far better known in a sense of just a quick reminder. We are now finally reaching the limits to the environmental capacity to handle human activity. It strikes me that you have to go back to the work of two remarkable women some decades ago to underpin that. First, obviously, was Rachel Carson back in the early 60s, whose brilliant book, Silent Spring, did so much to sort of focus people on the interconnectedness of the environment and the human impact. In that case, it was the pesticides and wildlife. That has some ways more significant and less known was the publication in 1971 of Limits to Growth, the first systematic analysis of the world system done by a team at MIT, very largely organized by Donella Meadows. She and her husband, Dennis, and two other systems analysts developed the first sort of really effective model of the world system, which included environmental factors. That was the key thing about Limits to Growth. And in doing so, they pointed to the huge risk in the future of a world exceeding its capacity. And then you can use the jargon, you know, just basically the world homeostasis, global system homeostasis being exceeded by anthropogenic factors. In other words, us doing too much damage to the environment to the extent that it can't cope. And in many ways, the reaction to Rachel Carson from the agrochemical industries was extremely rough. Basically, they would not accept a word of it. And the reaction to Donella Meadows and her team was, these are just doom-watch people. This ain't going to happen. Technologies will always see us through. The curious thing is that Limits to Growth, when you read it now, you find out two things. One, they were not predicting immediate problems. They were saying, if we continue this way, the problems are really going to arise in the 2010s and especially the 2020s and 2030s. In other words, 50 to 70 years beyond when they actually published the book. And I think we're now getting much more close to that. And in fact, a very interesting study done by a team, but I think it was University of Melbourne a few years ago, compared the predictions in Limits to Growth with what had happened in the first, 40 years. And it was uncannily accurate. That was the real worry. This is the era we're now in. And of course, at the center of that, without any question, is climate breakdown. Now, just obviously to sketch very quickly over that, the problem here is that over some tens of millions of years, vast amounts of fossil carbon were laid down in the form of oil, gases, and of course, coal. These are now being used by human society, not over tens of millions of years, but over tens of decades. And essentially what you're having is large quantities of carbon, primarily in the form of carbon dioxide, but also to some extent in the form of methane, are being put into the atmosphere. And essentially that is causing very big effects. Before I moved into environmental security at Bradford in peace studies, I worked for 8 years at Huddersfield Polytechnic, and we were developing a new degree course called Human Ecology, really quite radical for its time. And that brought together people doing politics, economics, ecology, human studies, and the rest. And in fact, I was checking through my notes 3 or 4 months ago when I was going through some old notes, and I found my lecture notes from 1972. And one of them was on the biogeochemical cycles, concentrating on the carbon cycle. And it said at the end of the lecture, there are indications that carbon dioxide is increasing in the atmosphere, and this may have major effects. So, you know, we're talking about exactly 50 years ago. This is already appearing in lectures in British universities, because I was far from the only one doing that at the time. So essentially, we'd known this a very long time. And I mean, the real action began to develop, obviously, in the 1990s with the Kyoto Protocol. But what we saw was some willingness to do it, very much under the UN auspices right through this process, but essentially an unwillingness by individual states to really follow through on it. It's curious, in fact, in the early 1990s, it was a big issue. We tend to forget this. I don't know if you remember, there was a fascinating film called The American President, based on a sort of Clinton lookalike. And the subplot was environmentalists trying to persuade the US government to cut carbon emissions. And that came out, I think, in 1995. And it looked like the world might start to make progress in this area. The Greens were developing, Friends of the Earth was growing. And in many countries, there was an awareness that this was a big problem. Unfortunately, that was thrown off beam by two quite different issues. One, inevitably, was 9/11. And for a decade or more, the world is sort of far more concerned with the war on terror. And to a very large extent, the whole issue of climate change and possible climate breakdown was almost discounted. It was sidelined. The second issue, though, is that many key governments did not think it was a problem. As far as George Bush was concerned, there was no real issue here. As far as many other governments took the view, this was not a major issue. There was a very, very strong opposition to doing anything about climate change from the major fossil carbon companies, oil, gas, and coal, and the major fossil carbon producing countries, particularly in the Middle East, but also the United States as well, and of course, Russia. And that basically persisted for years. And in spite of the best efforts of the UN in many different agencies, particularly, I would say, the far-sighted ideas and thinking in the UN Environment Programme, this problem really was sidelined until relatively recently. We've seen so many examples where countries just have not wanted to know. Certainly Russia right the way through, all the major Middle East oil producers, the United States, I have to say Canada to a large extent with all its oil sands, Australia, no question about that, and Brazil indirectly in that the Bolsonaro regime has really allowed the acceleration of the deforestation of Amazonia. And that, of course, is a huge carbon sink. So really, to cut a long story short, I think what we're seeing here is until a few years ago, the situation really looked pretty bleak. And in many cases where progress was being made, as in renewables, governments did not facilitate it. I mean, we're still even now giving pretty large subsidies to North Sea oil, even now, far larger than we're giving to renewables. And that really is just an example in one country of a much wider problem. So where we are with that at present seems to be that we are heading for a very serious issue. The report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of 2 years ago said, look, to be absolutely blunt about this, to stand any chance of keeping the level of increase in CO2 to the atmosphere below 1.5%, sorry, 1.5 degrees, then we actually have to decarbonize at the rate of 7% per year for 10 years. So the whole of the 2020s should be taken up by reducing the carbon output of the entire world by 7% per year. Compound interest, reverse compound interest, that means cutting down to about 43% of current levels. And the view was that if we can do that, then we stand a chance of actually avoiding climate breakdown as distinct from climate disasters. And essentially, that has gone by the board. Partly, I know, because of COVID and partly because of Ukraine, but the reality is we're not doing that. And the current requirement now is an 8% decrease in carbon emissions in each of the remaining 8 years, which simply is not going to be achieved at the present time. And it really looks like, therefore, we're coming into an era where climate breakdown does actually start in a real way. I'll come back to that in a little while, but I just want to touch on the final one, the security element, because we tend to forget that we view security primarily at a state level. All the efforts of the UN and other agencies to promote the idea of common security and human security, we still look at it very much at the state level of protecting the state and rely very heavily on the military means to do so. And I think it's this year, world military expenditure will hit $2 trillion a year equivalent for the first time. And it's certainly going to go through the roof in the next few years, not least because of the side effect of the Ukraine war, and that is already being seen. The problem is that this is a sort of a cultural thing. And when Eisenhower, of all people, famous soldier and a Republican president, warned us of the dangers of a powerful military industrial complex, we never really listened to that. Now, this isn't any one country. Any country with a reasonably large military will have a military industrial complex. It'll be composed of the military themselves, the civil servants in the ministries, defense industries massively, but also the think tanks, university departments, arms traders, and indeed trade unions who are looking after their own members and they're safeguarding them. And that is basically a very closely integrated system in any country with large armed forces, quintessentially the United States, but also significant in China, in Russia, some of the other big spenders like India, Britain certainly, essentially France, Germany, and the rest. I've seen this firsthand. As I say, I've been lecturing at defense colleges for 40 years. And you obviously see that when a commandant, obviously a very good senior military person, retires, that person almost invariably gets really good contracts to work for defense industries. And you can almost guarantee that any senior military officer or any senior civil servant who've worked in the areas of weapons development and proliferation can go straight into very lucrative positions when they retire. The whole thing is a kind of closed loop. And essentially, it seems to work very well. It's very profitable. The arms trade, I'm afraid, is frequently very corrupt. But it is a system. That is a system which needs enemies. And the problem is that climate change doesn't make for a very good enemy. Now, that sounds rather cynical, but I think that is the reality that we face. But I want to remind us, this is across all the major countries. This is not restricted to any one country. But the problem with this is then how do we meet the core issues? Now, I'm conscious I've been getting on for half an hour, and essentially it's been all the doom watch stuff. So let's turn it round. And let's start, I think, with the most immediate problem, which is climate breakdown. The issues are quite astonishing, and the way the news is changing on this in the last 5 years, maybe even 3 or 4 years, in spite of all the huge diversions, is quite startling. I mean, now, 5 years ago, weather forecasters would hardly ever link a particular heat wave with climate breakdown or climate change, more anodyne term. It sort of didn't really appear. Over the last 2 to 3 years, I would argue, that has changed and changed radically. It's partly due to a far greater awareness among younger people, but partly due to what is actually happening and what we can see. If you look at the newspapers virtually any day, this huge heat dome, which has been covering quite a lot of South Asia. It is not just India, it is also Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and even to some extent through to Southeast Asia. Now, it's not that these are breaking all records, except they're breaking records for it happening this early in the year. That is, again, a repeated problem. You look at the heat dome that was experienced in Canada, in British Columbia last year. At one point, virtually a town burned down in the space of maybe half an hour or so, because it couldn't resist the onset of the heat coming through from the forest surrounding it, burning it. We've had extraordinary floods, and we're having changes. I think the most extraordinary thing is the rate at which the changes are happening is actually faster than the climate scientists predicted. There was the report only 2 days ago, I think it was in some of the papers yesterday, that the Barents Sea in the Arctic is warming at 7 times the rate of the rest of the world. That's been known for some time, that for different reasons, the Arctic is warming faster than the rest of the world. It's typically been twice or three times as far. This last large area, the Barents Sea, is warming 7 times as fast. And of course, the faster it warms, the quicker the sea ice melts, the quicker the ice is replaced by open water, which absorbs more sunlight. So you get a straightforward positive feedback, the albedo effect. And the more that the Arctic warms, particularly if it's the fastest area, the more you get the permafrost actually melting with release of methane, which, while it doesn't last in the atmosphere very long, is far more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of global warming. That is known. People know things are changing. You can see almost around you that things are different. It's not new. I mean, my wife and I have sort of lived in what we call a very small holding here up in West Yorkshire for 50 years. And, I kept a gardening diary when we first got into the gardening thing 50 years ago. Going back to it now, you see, oh yes, the frogs spawn about 2 to 3 weeks earlier than they did 50 years ago. Basically, the leaf break is 2 to 3 weeks earlier. In the autumn comes 2 to 3 weeks later. These are actual physical things that you see. People have recognized that to some extent. It has come to the fore. And that, I think, is extremely good news, because at least people are waking up. You're getting some very determined activists who are prepared to go to jail if people don't listen to them. The other thing which I think is hugely positive is the transformation in the ability to use renewable energy. I'm slightly fortunate in this, in that one of our sons is a renewable energy engineer. He's worked in the tropics, is now lecturing at a British university, and another son is a maritime maritime engineering specialist, and his small company works in assessing the navigation risk of new major maritime projects. And a lot of their work now is coming from the plethora of new wind farms, because there's so many being produced. We're now well beyond the point where really well-sited wind farms produce electricity cheaper than any other form, including gas. Gas, coal, oil, nuclear, they're all more expensive. And that is transformative. To give a practical example, for some years, my wife was saying we really should invest in a PV array, photovoltaic array on the roof of our house. We are very lucky. We have an L-shaped house, and the vertical of the L, so to speak, faces southwest. And so we also have a roof which faces southeast. We got a solar water heating panel on about 15 years ago, which has worked fine. But we invested heavily, it cost a lot, in the PV array. And I was just looking at the figures. I think the total cost of our electricity last year was about £80 for the year, because of course we're producing so much of our own electricity. Okay, we had to use a lot of gas for electricity, it's there. But the point is, we actually had to find £11,500 for that system. It's paid for itself because of a good feed-in tariff just about now. But now the same system, exactly the same system, would cost you £4,500. But that, of course, is with 10 years of inflation. So basically, it's equivalent to £3,500 at that time. So basically, it's not much more than we're getting on towards sort of a quarter, certainly less than a third of the previous costs. And that is an example right across the board. Those changes can be made. We can decarbonize quick enough, provided that governments are willing to do it, and provided there's a very high level of intergovernmental cooperation. On the two other issues, it's a lot more tricky. There's some very good work I think, going on now in rethinking security. In a number of countries, you have small think tanks and very sort of persistent NGOs who are saying we've got to rethink what we mean, bring back the old thinking on human security and common security. If you're interested in this, then the British one is simply called rethinkingsecurity.org. It's called Rethinking Security. It is rethinkingsecurity.org, and that has just started an alternative security review for the UK. The full details are available on the website. And that, I think, is actually the kind of way forward. We're starting to rethink how we think security, what it means, and what really the priority is. For most ordinary people, frankly, fighting wars is far less important than preventing climate change. But that is not the way the whole system works. But I think that is going to be a very hard nut to crack unless you convince military that their job will be untenable if climate breakdown gets out of control. Remember, in terms of how quick that could happen, well, senior scientists saying we could be in very serious trouble within 5 years and certainly within 10 years. That's the state rate of change. As far as the economy is concerned, there's very good thinking going on things like the circular economy, the New Economics Foundation and the rest, all saying that essentially the neoliberal system is not working. You can turn it round without revolutions. I'm very dubious about revolutions of this sort because, as one person said, they merely change the accents of the elites. They don't really change things fundamentally. But what we do have to move is towards a transition. Now, I'm bound to say the prospects in Britain at the present time are not very strong given the policies of the current government. But elsewhere, there are changes afoot. And you see some of the interesting recent elections in Chile and Australia throwing in some new thinking, more or less towards the governments themselves. But at the same time, that has to happen pretty quickly. There have to be I mean, what is glaringly obvious in Britain is that we have to get control of the massive amounts of tax evasion and tax avoidance. Basically, Britain is the lead country in allowing and developing offshore wealth. And we are one of the worst offenders for this, yet we do very little about it. I think we have to probably bring some areas of the economy back under public control, particularly in the energy sector, and probably in the water sector as well, and maybe others as well. And also, perhaps most important of all, the government has to be prepared to invest in renewables and in energy conservation. The quickest way to drop Britain's carbon emissions is to have warm house schemes right throughout the country. And that just is not hugely costly. It produces an awful lot of jobs very quickly, and it is really there for the asking. So what I'm trying to say at the end is that worldwide, we are basically in the global thing, and I was asked to speak out global challenges. The real global challenge that we face is living within the confines of our own planetary system. And we are not doing very well at that at the moment. I'm not for a moment denying that there are other issues, and we still have the very big issue of nuclear weapons and indeed the risk of biological and chemical weapons. We've seen that, you know, you can get wars developing incredibly quickly, particularly what is happening in Ukraine, which we, if you wish, we can discuss over the question and answer. But I'm conscious of the fact I've gone almost on to 40 minutes. So what I would suggest we do is perhaps leave it at that. I don't know if you just want to take a sort of a 1 minute pause or go straight into discussion. And I'll try and handle anything, but I promise you one thing, any questions that I can't answer, I will say so at the start.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. We will take a 1 minute pause for people to think of questions to write on chat. I can see one question. I've put 3 or 4 questions myself. Okay, yeah, I mean, the chat would be a good way of distributing these questions. Let me take one question before I take my questions. Kirsten Lamb, I believe, has asked the question. Your 3 major factors didn't include world population. The population of the world has grown from 3 to 7.9 billion since 1960. This obviously puts immense pressure on global systems. However, population growth has slowed dramatically. Is that a possible source of optimism?
In short, yes, I think it is. I mean, I certainly saw this myself. My first post, and this illustrates my age, which is 79 incidentally, was right at the end of the 1960s. And that was working in tropical crop research in Uganda. I was also working partly in Kenya and Tanzania, but I was based in Uganda. At the time, Uganda had a population of about 11 million. Its population now is about 34 million. And, you know, if I look at Google Earth and look at where I lived about 8 miles from the center of Kampala, at the Uganda Government Agricultural Research Station at Kawanda. And basically that was essentially 6 miles outside the city boundary. Now it's virtually within the city. In fact, all the experimental fields are surrounded by shambas, by local smallholdings. So that's to give some indication. But you're absolutely right, Kirsten, in that there has been a very major change. I can't remember the details, but certainly if we go back to sort of that period of 50 or so years ago, they were predicting the world population would grow to sort of 12 or 15 billion. It has slowed down very strongly. Not everywhere. In fact, Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East are the areas of sort of continued growth at the highest level. But elsewhere, and probably surprisingly bluntly, in Latin America, where the religious tendency would be to sort of discourage birth control, it has happened there as well. And many of the northern states, if you like to call the global north, many of those countries are actually facing an issue of too many old people. I can never understand the idea that Britain should not be taking migrants in. We need young people. The interesting thing is Scotland is much more positive about inward immigration than England is. Seems to be a peculiar English thing. But the reality is that population growth is heading now towards a plateau. And if, and it is still a big if, it develops in the Middle East, or even more difficulty with sub-Saharan Africa, then that will not be the major issue that it was. But certainly if we were talking about 40, 50 years ago, or indeed, you know, when Edwin Brooks made his comments, then the issue of the crowded, glowering planet, there is potential now, at least at that area, that wouldn't be the biggest problem. The problem, of course, is too many people live way beyond the means of the planet. And those are, by and large, the much richer people.
Thank you. Thanks. I've got a question mainly focused on capitalism, the thing that probably started the cause of climate change. The question is slightly philosophical. Is democracy working for us? Is it being undermined by capitalism, where a small elite control everything from economy, media, power, military? How much better are we from state-controlled nations like China?
Oh, that's a really tricky one. I mean, it's certainly true that China has strongly embraced what is commonly termed authoritarian capitalism. I think we have bigger problems than we realize. The problem with this is once you even use this language, you appear to be a conspiracy theorist. You know, I don't see the sort of small gang of super rich people controlling things. But I think it is very true that probably the world's richest 1% of people have considerable control. Other examples, I mean, one of the most interesting examples is, if you remember, in Britain, 2015, 2016, we had several major campaigns which were about Britain getting out of the European Union. Now, let's not argue one way or another about that, but the reality is there are a number of campaigns. There was some quite interesting applied research done as to basically how much money was being spent on these campaigns. Many of them were not official, and who was funding it. And the idea seemed to be, well, these are a number of campaigns, but they came from ordinary people, lots of money coming in from ordinary people. That's not actually true. The account I saw, which was in the Independent, I think 3 or 4 years ago, was that about £24 million had been spent on the campaigns to get Britain out of the EU, and 5 people responsible for 2/3 of that spending. 5 extremely rich people who seemed likely to benefit particularly from the kind of changes that would happen when Britain left the EU. So that, I think, is a very clear example. And one has to say that in the United States, the funding of political parties is a massive issue, whatever the government regulations are concerned. And that is also true in Britain. You know, you have one party, I won't name it for obvious reasons, but essentially an awful lot of its support comes from a handful of people. Another party gets it from trade unions, or did do, not so much now. But essentially, there is a great deal of control. I think, whether you like it or not, it's not control in terms of sort of, I don't know how to put it, organized purely. It just comes naturally. You know, this is the way things are. This is the way things work. It's who you know and what the people who basically have the power and the money can do. So I'm afraid that I think democracy in theory is an extremely good thing. In practice, it still has a very long way to go. I'm struck in a slightly different context by, some of you may remember, back in the 1980s, there was actually a spat between New Zealand and the United States. The United States was not willing to say which of its warships had nuclear weapons on board when they went into foreign ports. The New Zealanders, under a rather sort of quite charismatic Prime Minister, David Longhi, said, no, we're not having that. If you want to come and have your recreation in New Zealand ports, you're welcome, but we need to know that your ships are not carrying nuclear weapons. And this caused quite a problem for several years. And at one point, the American ambassador in Wellington was heard to remark, you know, it's so much easier dealing with Asian dictatorships than it is with messy democracies. Now, see, democracies, when they are good, can be rather messy, and they can throw up disagreements and the rest. I think we've got quite a long way to go, and I wish it was other. But the reality is that power rests in many different hands, and global corporations, some of them are immensely powerful. And you see that classically with the oil and gas industries and how they've been working so assiduously with individual countries to curb any real response to climate breakdown, and are doing it now. I mean, there's more recent information about the carbon bomb, the way in which oil companies are investing as heavily as they can, as quickly as they can, to get more oil out of the ground, simply because they know they're going to have to stop fairly soon, because there'll be such a public outcry that governments will have to change their policies. So again, it's a long-winded. I'll keep my answer short. Sorry, you know what academics are like.
Sure.
So go on.
Thank you. Question from Trevor Evans. It seems that there has been increased lack of trust between governments, both East and West and North and South, making reaching agreements on peace and sustainability more difficult. How can we build trust?
Oh gosh, Trevor, I wish I could give you a sort of a sensible answer. I mean, it's absolutely spot on. I agree with you very much. And there's been a deterioration in respect for governments and in the behavior of governments in many different countries. And it also links in with, well, so it links in a way with the idea that individual countries have to look to themselves. I mean, we talk about, you know, Trump and making America great again. But you look at Macron making France great again. Britain, giving Britain its new global role, sort of a global leader with its aircraft carriers and missile submarines and precious space on the Security Council. But you look at Turkey, you look at India under Modi, you look at so many others, it's as though individual countries are sort of focusing on themselves. It seems to link to some extent with the rise of populisms, which in turn tend to arise when people are dissatisfied with the status quo and basically want some sort of change. And if you can get very sharp politicians who can ride a particular wave and play to it, it helps them a lot. I mean, I have to say personally, I find that we find in Britain at present, there is this idea that, you know, the Brexiters were facing up to this elite which really runs the country. Many of the Brexiters were actually part of the very elite. And you're also seeing in Britain the use of particular leading statements and policies from the centre, which feed into a rather crude response in the periphery. I think a classic example is racism. I mean, I would say a particular example is in the news again this morning, the idea that some asylum seekers should be fitted with trackers so that, you know, the government knows exactly where they are at all the time. Now, that I believe is a hugely dangerous step towards a system which is even more restrictive. And one has to be conscious of the fact that we've been doing systematically improving the laws to control protest. Now, this is not necessarily a reflection of overall democratic thinking, but and we're seeing this in many different countries. It's as though, you know, people do not seem to have the courage to accept the need for discussion and debate, and are looking really for quick, short answers. It is aided a lot by the ability of false information to be spread so quickly. I'm conscious, Trevor, I'm not giving you straight answers. I suppose the real issue is the more we are aware of this issue and see the interconnectedness of it. And I think part of the interconnection, I'm sorry to say, does go right back to the neoliberal transition. They were getting a more and more divided world economically. And, you know, people will then turn to, well, they'll turn to whoever they think provides a different way. There's no doubt at all that a lot of the sort of rise of the radical, the extreme Islamist factions is made much easier. It's not due to, but made much easier by wholesale marginalization of young people. You look at what's happening across many of the movements in sub-Saharan Africa, where young people, mostly men, have extremely lousy life chances. So you get people coming along, proselytizing a particular view, focused on an extremely puritanical version of Islam and saying, this is the way forward. This gives you a possibility for life. And I think that is happening repeatedly. They're easy answers which are fed to people, and those who are providing them are not in the business of improving society. I'm afraid they're largely in the business of their own power.
Thank you. I've got a climate-related question. Roughly how much investment is needed to decarbonize the world at 8% per annum for the next 8 years? Where will this money come from? What about the LDCs? And a slightly additional question, ultimately, is state control the only way to control climate quickly and effectively?
I always fearful of starting with the last one first, because by the time we get through it, I'd have actually forgotten the early bit. No, essentially, you have to have intergovernmental, coordinated intergovernmental action. I don't think there's any other way, within countries and between countries. I mean, a very good example of what could have happened in Britain under the Labour government through to 2010. This process of the idea of feed-in tariffs for home-produced home-installed photovoltaic arrays was mounted. And it was maintained in the early years of the coalition, largely, I have to say, through Lib Dem support. They were in coalition, they said, this stays. And the point is that when you actually had a single party in power, that party did not take this view. And in 2015, there were huge cuts in feed-in tariffs, so much so that it had not become easily economic for most people to even consider it. Within a matter of a few months, an industry that was developing rapidly stopped overnight. And, you know, all the roofer companies have been specializing in installing PV. Most of them just gave up and went back to the roofing work. We lost a glorious opportunity then to speed up the rate of decarbonization. As we've already touched on earlier on, there are these incredibly ways of coping with this quite cheaply in the business of warm homes. I mean, my own council, Kirklees, which is mainly Huddersfield, had a bit of a windfall about 10 years ago because it sold off its share in Leeds Bradford Airport. And because the Greens were quite prominent in the council at that time, for a time they actually held the balance of power, they actually brought in a council developed process of loft insulation. Now, we already had pretty good loft insulation in our house, but the guy came round and said, you should have more. And they installed it for free. And they did that right across the borough. And the cost was not great. The employment was considerable. And essentially, it worked a treat. So I don't know the answer directly to the actual the cost. There's nothing like as much as people think, but they are also considerable. And I think particularly the point made about the global south, if you like, developing countries, that is just crying out for support. Because the point about here, you know, there's another source of optimism here. If you look across the global south, the willingness of people to essentially embrace new systems which work better and are affordable is remarkable. You know, until, say, when I worked in East Africa, there wasn't very much of an electricity grid system, certainly in Uganda, outside of Kampala and Ginger and a couple of other places. But essentially, there were kids who were very keen to learn. The government was trying to get all the kids through at least 4 years of education. But, you know, if they were going to do any kind of homework or work in the evenings, it had to be with kerosene lamps because it got dark at 7 o'clock every night on the equator. And the point is that was actually dangerous to health and costly. But now, you know, you get a very cheap system, which basically consists of a small PV pad plus a rechargeable battery plus an LED lamp. And that is just left outside the house during the day. And by the evening, you have the equivalent of 4 to 6 hours of light. And once you paid for it, that's it. And I don't remember what the figures are now. It's something like the cost of kerosene for about 10 months will provide you with this system, which will last indefinitely. And so that's the kind of possibility. And people are doing it by the score, by the million, in fact. That is an area where in much of tropical Africa, there was a leapfrogging from landline telephones through to mobile phones. And you know, many people never even got a landline phone. They went straight through to mobile phones. They embraced the technology. And that can be done time and time again. We spent some time in Cuba about 8 or 10 years ago. And if you go to the rural areas, village schools, virtually everyone we saw had a PV array. So basically, it didn't have to be connected to a grid. I know I'm rambling on, but what I'm saying is that's a huge issue because it has to be done in and for and with the global south. I think it's absolutely appalling, bluntly. I mean, I'm speaking personally, I'm not representing Bradford University, but I think it's appalling that this government has taken a load of money out of the out of the development budget, and by sheer chance is putting the same amount of money into the military budget. We should be increasing our development budget, which should go back up to 0.7% and exceed it, and put a lot more effort into aiding global South countries in doing the green transition quickly. So, you know, I just agree entirely that that is an area where we can gain and can gain quickly.
Thank you. We've got 3 or 4 questions. Maybe we could keep the answers short.
I will do. Sorry about that.
Sure. From Nusa, regarding security threats, her question is, are the security threats in global north significantly different from those in the north from political, cultural, and personal perspective?
Oh, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how I can best answer that. Could you just repeat it? Could you just repeat it, please? Or where are we? Sorry, I just missed the question. Yeah, I've just lost it on chat. Is it in chat? Has anybody got access to the question? Just repeat it. I'm just trying to think of how to answer it best.
I think, Paul, it was whether the security challenges in the global south were qualitatively different from the security challenges in the north. That's what I.
Fair enough. Yes, fair enough. Right.
Incidentally, hello from 20 or 30 years ago.
Hello, Kevin. It's lovely to see you again. Yes, yes.
Apologies.
We're still around. Yes, obviously they do. I mean, the security challenges in the south are much more at the human level. No question about that. You know, we still have the huge. I mean, look at the health problems. Look at the problems even now of malnutrition. Look at the problems of personal security. So many of those are actually much stronger in the south. And essentially, I think you also found across quite a large number of parts of the world of a limitation on individual freedom. Now, I'm not sure that ours is quite as good as we think, but certainly in many parts of the world, no. Whereas I think in the security challenges in the north, well, the curious thing I find, and let's leave Ukraine to one side, because in many ways that is an important aberration, but it is an aberration. We almost look for security challenges which require the military. It's quite extraordinary that, you know, it's almost as though, you know, you always have to have enemies of one sort or another. And in many ways, the 1990s was a rather bad period because Gorbachev had done that terrible thing. He'd taken away the West's enemy from it by basically trying what happened in the Soviet Union. And I think in many ways, what we're seeing is an attitude to security which does not recognize the nature of the global problems. In the analysis, I think the key thing about this is that global problems are, in the final analysis, they are common problems. And the common problems are of an economic system which is not fit for purpose, and an environmental crisis which is getting demonstrably worse and is accelerating. But our response almost always is to meet the problems once they occur rather than prevent them happening. So I think essentially those problems are common to the entire world, but they are demonstrated, I think, in different ways. That's the word I'm looking for. But in the global south, for example, if you have, you know, a really bad harvest, you know, a relatively small farmer working partly on subsistence farming, if you don't have money to buy more expensive food, you have really big problems. In the global north, until recently at least, by and large, you could buy your way out of things. I mean, even at the height of the global world food crisis back in 73, 74, there was never a time when there wasn't enough grain to go around. World grain reserves on average went down by 50%, which was very dangerous, but they never disappeared. But the problem was people could not afford to buy food. And that is a problem now in many ways. So that again comes back to some extent to economic differentials. But yes, I think really the problems are basically the same, but they're demonstrated in different ways and more immediately across the global south. Let me put it that way.
Thank you. We've got a question, I believe, from Tony Wills. You mentioned that $2 trillion is currently being spent globally by the defense industry fueling the aims of the MIC. Why is our media so reluctant to acknowledge this to a wider audience? And more generally, why is our media not open to other minority views on Ukraine and other conflicts?
Well, I mean, why is this not more common knowledge? Well, I think for a start, you know, if it's a very successful system for many people, they don't want it to be public knowledge. You know, I mean, if you actually have a system in which you have, you know, very significant centers of power, I don't want to use the term powerful groups because again, you get straight into the conspiracy thing. But the reality is that, you know, well, I'll answer it in a slightly different way. Why is it that so few people understand the nature of the neoliberal transition? You know, virtually any government, and I'm not just talking about the Conservative government, any government in Britain will say, you know, we can't afford to pay for that, or we can't afford to pay for this. How are we going to afford to pay for it? They won't acknowledge that, in fact, underneath, it's not that we can't afford to pay, it's that the money is going into too few hands. And I'm not talking about, you know, a few incredibly rich billionaires. I'm talking about, you know, many people. The division in Britain is basically at a crude level, about 1% are doing incredibly well, but about 30% are doing pretty well. Probably most of us here discussing this morning. And then another 30%, you know, it's a bit touch and go. And something like 30% plus really are in difficulty. But as long as you have enough people doing reasonably well, and you have a system which does not provide the extent of social welfare, then that really means more and more people on the edge. And I think the problem that a number of governments are facing now is that because of this combination of economic issues and indeed in the short term, the effect of Ukraine, the effects for the poorer parts of people, the poorer populations in richer countries are suddenly becoming grievous. And behind the scenes, I think many governments are worried about the social stability of the next couple of winters because of the way that people are actually finding it so difficult. And we had a period last winter where in a number of countries, there were actually public outrage. I mean, you saw what's happening in Sri Lanka recently, what's happening now in India. People are reacting on occasions, I'm afraid, with violence. But there isn't the realization about how the whole system works, that ultimately it is not a fair system. I'm not a Marxist, incidentally, but I do think that one has to understand why this is happening. But, you know, if you have, well, let's be blunt about it, the majority of the British press is owned by 3 billionaire families. Now, you know, that it inevitably means that the major print media will actually tend to concentrate on what's good for the owners of the major print media. I'm sorry to be blunt about this, but it's blindingly obvious that this is the case. But the problem is that this is not widely recognized. You have very good alternative sources of news now, but they're basically pretty small, although they're growing pretty rapidly. And there's some very good sites to go to. All this stuff is readily available, but it is not mass distributed. I think that's a very big problem.
Thank you. We've got a question from Nigel Quentin, well, actually two questions, if I could pick his last one, which is, how worried are you by the potential alignment of China with Russia, possibly what Putin meant as his new world order?
Well, I mean, if you look at what Putin is about, it's about the idea of the Eurasia and the greater Russia really at the head of it. And the whole point about Ukraine was really to extend Russian influence right through almost into NATO itself. And he envisaged this sort of greater Eurasia in this very odd way of Russia being at the head of this entity, even though China is far more significant economically and probably militarily, apart from nuclear weapons. So essentially, yes, he has seen this. I think Beijing was fairly supportive of Russia originally. Now it's getting rather cherry because of the mess that is being developed in Ukraine and the effect on the Russian economy. I think the other side of the coin is we have to face the fact that within American strategic thinking, there's a group, a minority, but a significantly influential lot, which says this is a golden opportunity to cripple Russia long term. And basically will remove sort of one wing of this sort of Russia-China entity. Because obviously it stands to reason that a very powerful country like the United States is concerned about the erosion of its power by the growth of China, and until recently of the power of the Soviet Union as it was, Russia more recently. And essentially, I think on that basis, there is a concern. I mean, the reality is that China is very successful economically, autocratic, but essentially it is going to be the dominant economy, probably. I say probably because people tend to forget that one of the countries which will experience climate breakdown quicker than any others is actually China itself. And this is one of the reasons why the Chinese are heading into green technologies pretty quickly, but not quickly enough. But the issue here, I think, in a way, is that it is a factor, and one suspects that it would be no bad thing, to put it crudely, if the war in Ukraine went on for a long time and further crippled the Russian military machine. It's a terrible thing to say, but I think there's certainly some people who actually feel that. It makes it even more important, in my view, to try and get some sort of settlement. And at least one saving grace is that Zelensky and the Ukraine government are still prepared to go for a degree of compromise. Some of them are being advised not to by outside forces, but essentially they will do so. But it has not been possible to get through to the people around Putin that what he is about is untenable. I would hope that behind the scenes, Western diplomats and others from the states across the world are putting as much pressure on Beijing to influence Russia and the Kremlin in particular to get a settlement as soon as possible. Because one of the great things about the UN system is once there's any possibility of negotiation, you have some extremely good people and a huge amount of knowledge about how things can actually move quite quickly.
Thank you. We've got two UN questions. One you may have already answered from Trevor. Can the UN do more to reconcile NATO and Russia? And the other UN question is how to regain support for UN and multilateral cooperation for common security and human security, from Anthony Bellion.
Yes, there's so many good things about the UN, and people tend to forget that. I mean, look at the work that the UN did back in UNCTAD in the 1960s, plotting a way for a much fairer new international economic order. They got quite a long way in the early 70s, but then it got lost in all the changes that happened then. Look at all the work the WHO has done, the International Labour Office, the work of the UN Environment Programme. You know, it's saying for years that we had an ozone problem, and essentially, eventually, certainly we found we did, which incidentally, of course, was met relatively quickly. Not fully adequately, but we did actually get the Montreal Convention within 4 years of that problem being recognized. So, you know, there are many things going for the UN. The problem is that it is the prisoner of the most important and most powerful states. Now, how do you turn it round? I'm not sure I can offer much more. I mean, I'm sure, you know, people in the UNA tear their hair out of this because it is so obvious. There are always good alternatives. I mean, I think the UN work on the prevention of nuclear weapons, the new treaty. I mean, we're now up to, I think, is it 60 that have actually signed it? And no, more than 60 signed it, but I think it's 60 that ratified it in the space of less than 3 years. And that is the treaty. It's a convention banning nuclear weapons. I mean, my personal view is, you know, a country like Britain, which could kill 120 million, was it 20 million people in basically an hour and a half, I don't think that's civilized myself. I don't think it's a civilized function. I think any country that's based its defense policy on the willingness to kill at least 20 million people in the space of half a day at most is a country that is not fit to be considered a civilized country. Okay, that's blunt, but that's how I feel. The UN, I think, is working as best as it can. I don't know what you think, but as an outsider view, I think the current Secretary General is one of the best that the organization has had. But it is an uphill struggle the whole time. All you can say is that the UN gets proved right so often. You know, the UN point person in Afghanistan, the way people like Lakhdar Brahimi was speaking when the Taliban came apart in 2001, 2002, they were warning about the security vacuum. Time and time again, you look at the UN standing back, saying it much more what it is. The way the WHO is repeatedly saying that COVID-19 is more serious than people said in the first month or so, you just sort of despair that people don't take it seriously. But at least the UN is there. And that's the only thing I can really say. There's not much more I can offer, except to share the issue that the more, I mean, put it this way, I think Britain should put far more into ensuring it has the highest quality people going into the UN and back it more fully and back peacekeeping much more fully. I'd love to see Britain's armed forces as committed to peacekeeping, say the tiny Irish contingent is. But we're not there. But that's one thing which I would certainly say, you know, is a very strong argument that opposition parties could put, and they would be surprised how keen people would be at actually following that kind of thing through.
Thank you. We've got two last questions, one from Peter Riley. It's quite a complicated question.
Right.
He says, it is the interconnectedness between your three challenges that worries me. Deteriorating economic conditions and security mean that politicians can't or won't properly address the climate crisis. I guess the question is, how do we break out of this cycle? For example, do we accept a less satisfactory peace in Ukraine to save Western economies and then get a focus on climate change?
Well, I think whatever happens in Ukraine, the outcome will not be fully satisfactory to anybody. And the reason for this is, you know, the reality is that neither side can win, but neither side can lose. And what I mean by that is that the more Russia tries to gain control of Donbass and more, the more Western countries, NATO in particular, will help Ukraine prevent that. On the other hand, Western countries aiding Ukraine and Ukraine itself cannot win in the conventional sense because Russia is a nuclear power and could threaten to go nuclear. And in fact, Putin's already done that by inference. So you have to have a degree of compromise. It's going to be very bitter, but it's going to do huge damage long-term to Russia. Let's be clear about that, whatever happens. But essentially, I don't think we would want to see, I don't think we can see what we would want to see, a sort of a complete success for Ukraine. Unfortunately, I think there are factors against that. So that is one particular issue. But your wider point, I absolutely agree with. The difficulty is trying to integrate the fact we've got three problems, all of which need to be approached. Against that, the climate one is becoming so obvious so quickly that I think this is where the change can happen. And I find, particularly among younger people who really think these things through, they see the connection between the nature of the economic system and the failure to tackle climate breakdown much more clearer than the older generation, by and large. And so I think there is an acceptance that you have to integrate the two. The security one is even more difficult in a way, but we just have to work at that. But the key thing here with all of this is whatever area you yourself work in, whatever else our individual people try to do, you know, whether we're working for sort of a Greenpeace type thing or committed to amnesty or refugee aid and all the rest, the important thing is to see ourselves as part of a much wider possibility of change. Many more people, no one is isolated in this. Whatever part you're in, it can be daunting. But the point is you're part of a much wider group of people operating different ways. I think the need to actually integrate these issues is a key one, and that's the area I choose to work on, but others can work in other areas.
Thank you. We've got two last questions.
Right. Okay.
Sorry, we'll have to say that's the last two. One from Anthony Valiant. Political debate, the Labour Party and maybe others, is self-censoring debate amongst its MPs on issues mentioned like NATO, nuclear weapons, etc., perhaps to be seen as electable. Why are we allowing themselves to be muted and not discuss the pros and cons of each?
I think there's a problem within the British political system that essentially opposition parties, by and large, are worried about easily being labelled unpatriotic. I think it's all about Britain's history as a major significant power. That is very easy for people to say, oh, well, if you're talking about, you know, that's appeasement and all the rest. And in fact, when you look at the opinion polling, an awful lot of people, I think a majority of people would like to see a world without nuclear weapons. In fact, a very large majority. And many people would be far more supportive of the UN Convention than is realized. So the polling doesn't reflect this sort of mood. But I think it's so easy for people to be labeled sort of wild extremists. And the Labour Party, I think in particular, is simply not prepared to even stand up on a series of issues. I find it a very disappointing party, frankly. and it was slightly different in the brief Corbyn era. I mean, I have to admit that, in fact, Corbyn's Geneva speech, the one that he gave on international affairs, I think is one of the best speeches on international affairs and international security that I've seen from a politician in many years, because he was focusing on exactly the sorts of issues we've all been talking about this morning, which don't figure in most considerations of international security. But it's a major problem. We have to face up to it and be prepared to say what we think. If you're a member of a political party, really say it. If you're not, then talk it. But I have to accept it's an issue. We will not call for any decrease in defense spending, even though our defense spending is phenomenally inefficient and all the rest. And I really can't understand why we seem to think that, you know, spending, was it £200 billion lifetime on the Trident replacement makes any kind of security sense. But then maybe I'm in a minority on that.
Thank you. From Kevin Featherstone, NATO has been slow to help Ukraine and has done so only limitedly. So is this telling us the value of NATO to European security is much less than we thought?
I do have some problems with NATO. I mean, the reality is that NATO has failed so grievously in Afghanistan. NATO has been a very significant player in Afghanistan, to a lesser extent in Iraq, but in Afghanistan, is basically one of the key actors right through, and it has not been a very successful alliance. I think, if anything, yes, it has been slow to really help Ukraine in the direct way that Ukraine wanted it. But the issue here, I think, is that NATO, if anything, feels strengthened now. It feels strengthened because people think, yes, well, we must have NATO. The problem with that is, well, again, this can upset people, I know, but let's be straight about it. If you look across world opinion, and there are one or two very big polling organizations that do global opinion, and you ask what the global opinion is of the Ukraine war, you get a pretty surprising result. Across most of the global south, the support is not overwhelmingly for the West. In fact, if anything, you get a very strong mood of a plague on both your houses. People are very antagonistic to what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, but they don't actually rate what the West does very much more strongly. It was put to me not long ago by, a Palestinian student, it happened, but it could have been anybody, that essentially, from the perspective of somebody in the Middle East, what the Russians did to Mariupol, destroying a large part of the center of the city, was appalling. But it was almost exactly the same as what the Western coalition did to Fallujah in November 2004 and to Western Mosul more recently. Western Mosul was virtually razed to the ground because it's the only way to deal with ISIS. And essentially, different countries, I suppose that the problem here is that the way we've seen the Ukraine war on television has really been an eye-opener to Western audiences. It's not to Middle Eastern audience, who were getting that level of coverage through Al Jazeera for what was happening in Iraq, with all the casualties, the suffering and the damage. So essentially, we're seeing war as it really is, and we don't like it, and thank heavens we don't like it. But it does mean that we tend to look at it in a sort of slightly blinkered way normally. We don't see it the way the whole world sees it. And I think the worry is that NATO will actually come out of this stronger, which will be good in the case of Ukraine, but the tendency then will be for NATO to be more representative of a Western global elite. And that means that it's going to be out of kilter with the majority of the world. It's difficult to see how this is going to go, but at the moment I have some unease about NATO doing this job to help Ukraine, but in doing so, regarding itself as the world's police officer, policing the world in the way that it thinks it wants to be policed. Because you track all the thinking within NATO over the last 30 years, very little consideration has been given to climate change. Now, if any organization was meant to be looking at that as a major threat, it is NATO. But essentially, I haven't seen very much of it, and that I find worrying.
Thank you very much, Professor Paul Rogers. I think that was an excellent answer to an excellent question. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time. Good luck to your event with Professor Sakwa. Can we show our appreciation to Paul Rogers, please? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Good luck with your own organization.
Thank you very much,
for the
Paul.
UN.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.